Are you lost, Grandpa? The voice was sharp, laced with the brittle confidence of youth and rank. It cut through the symphony of the pier, a discordant note in the chaotic harmony of clanging metal, shouting men, and the ceaseless, hungry whine of ventilation systems. The old man did not flinch. He stood near the brow of the aircraft carrier, a stooped silhouette against the immense gray cliff of the hull. He wore simple khaki trousers and a faded blue work shirt, clothes that had seen decades of labor and washing. His hands, gnarled and stained with the memory of oil, were clasped loosely behind his back. He looked like a misplaced tourist, a relic washed up on the shores of the modern Navy. Lieutenant Junior Grade Caden Vance strode forward, his polished boots clicking with crisp annoyance on the non-skid surface of the flight deck. Vance was 26. He was sharp, ambitious, and utterly certain of his place in the world. That place was here, on the deck of the USS Defiance, where he was the officer in charge of a multi-million-dollar piece of machinery that had decided, at the worst possible moment, to stop working. Catapult 2 was down. Hard down. A high-pressure steam valve, buried deep in its mechanical guts, was seized. The engineers were stumped. The technicians were frustrated. The clock was ticking toward a critical readiness evaluation, and Vance's career was ticking right along with it. The last thing he needed was a civilian wandering into his disaster zone. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Vance said, his voice tightening. He stopped directly in front of the old man, deliberately using his height and the crisp authority of his uniform to create an intimidating presence. The old man's eyes, a pale and watery blue, finally lifted to meet his. They were calm, unbearably calm. "Just watching," the old man said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones tumbling in a slow river. "There's nothing to watch," Vance snapped, gesturing impatiently at the cluster of sweating engineers. "We have a technical problem. I need you to return to the pier." The old man's gaze drifted past Vance, settling on the silent, steel track of the useless catapult. He tilted his head, a gesture of pure, analytical curiosity. It was the look of a watchmaker examining a broken timepiece. "She's not breathing right," the old man murmured, more to himself than to Vance. Vance's jaw tightened. "Breathing right? It's a steam catapult, not a prize horse. It's a complex system, far beyond your—" He stopped himself, reining in the full measure of his condescension. "Barely. Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. Security will escort you." The old man paid him no mind. He took a slow, shuffling step closer to the edge of the deck, his eyes tracing invisible lines in the air, following the path of pipes and conduits that ran beneath the steel plates. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. A low groan from deep within the ship's structure. A hiss of latent pressure. "The bypass accumulator," the old man said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "It's chattering." Vance stared. He had no idea what that meant. It sounded like nonsense, the ramblings of a confused mind. The techs had been focused on the main launch valve, the digital control interfaces, the software. "Right. The chattering accumulator," Vance said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thank you for the diagnosis. Now, if you'll please." The old man turned his full attention back to Vance. For the first time, a flicker of something other than placid observation entered his eyes. It was a profound, weary sadness. He unclasped his hands from behind his back. He knelt, with a slight groan of aged joints, and placed a small, worn canvas tool bag on the deck. With deliberate slowness, he unrolled the flap. Inside, nestled in faded felt pockets, were not the gleaming, laser-etched tools of a modern technician. They were old, hand-forged, it seemed. Each one bore the marks of 1,000 uses. He selected a single tool. It was a T-handle wrench, but unlike any Vance had ever seen. The shaft was dark, oil-seasoned steel. The handle was wrapped in worn leather cord. At the base of the handle, a tiny, crudely stamped emblem was just barely visible. A ghost. The old man stood up, holding the wrench in his right hand. It seemed to be an extension of his arm. "I can listen to her," he said quietly. Vance felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. The stress of the situation, the pressure from the captain, the utter gall of this senile old man with his antique junk. It all boiled over. "What's in there, Grandpa? A magic wand?" he sneered, gesturing at the bag. He pointed a rigid finger at the T-handle wrench. You probably 3D printed that in your garage. He took a step forward, his personal space violation complete and aggressive. Give me that, he demanded. You are now a security threat. The old man didn't move. He simply held the wrench, his grip loose but certain. This tool and I, the old man said, his voice impossibly soft, put the Forrestal back in the fight in 67. We convinced the launch valve on the Kitty Hawk to behave in 72. It knows these machines. Vance laughed. A short, ugly bark. Right. You and the General, best pals, I'm sure. I'm done with this. He reached out, intending to snatch the wrench away. His fingers brushed against the cold steel. The moment his skin made contact, the world shifted for the old man. It was no longer the sun-drenched deck of the Defiance. It was a dark and stormy night in the Tonkin Gulf. Rain lashed down, cold and furious. The deck pitched violently. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel, salt, and fear. A Phantom F-4, loaded for a strike, sat crippled on the catapult. Its engine screamed, a wounded beast. The launch bar had failed to release. The catapult had fired, but the plane remained, straining against its chains, threatening to tear itself apart. He was there, a young man then, with this very wrench in his hand. He was under the jet, hot hydraulic fluid dripping on his face, the deck plates vibrating with a terrifying energy. He had 3 seconds to manually trip the emergency release before the entire assembly failed catastrophically. He remembered the feeling of the wrench seating perfectly into the custom bolt he himself had designed for just this contingency. The sharp, satisfying crack as the mechanism released. The sudden lurch as the Phantom was freed, seconds before disaster. He smelled the cordite. He felt the rain. He blinked. The sun on the deck of the Defiance was blinding. Lieutenant Vance was staring at him, his face a mask of arrogant fury. What is wrong with you? Vance hissed, pulling his hand back. The old man just looked at the wrench in his own hand, a sad, knowing smile touching his lips. He had almost forgotten. From across the deck, Chief Petty Officer Martinez watched the entire exchange. Martinez was a man who had learned to pay attention. He had seen enough young, ambitious officers like Vance burn themselves out on the pyre of their own certainty. He had also learned a deep, abiding respect for the quiet ones. The old-timers. The ones who didn't need to shout to be heard. Something about the old man was different. It was his stillness. In the midst of the controlled chaos, the shouting, the movement, the old man was a point of absolute calm. A rock in a raging stream. And when he brought out that tool, Martinez felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He had seen tools like that before. In a dusty display case in the Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola. They were labeled Field Expedient Modifications, relics from a time when ingenuity, not a manual, solved problems. He saw Vance reach for the old man. He saw the final line being crossed. That was enough. Martinez turned, melting into the flow of deck personnel. He pulled out his phone, his thumb flying over the screen. He didn't call the ship's security. He didn't call the officer of the deck. He called a number he was only supposed to use in the gravest of emergencies. The direct line to the aid of the commander, Naval Air Forces Atlantic. The phone was answered on the first ring. Commander's aide. This is Chief Martinez on the Defiance, he said, keeping his voice low and urgent. Sir, I apologize for the direct call, but we have a situation on the flight deck. What is it, Chief? The aide's voice was impatient. Catapult 2 is down. The Admiral is already aware of that. But there's a civilian on deck. An old man. One of our junior-grade lieutenants is about to have him forcibly removed. So, let security handle it. Why are you calling me? Martinez took a breath. Sir, the man's name is Miller. Silas Miller. And he's holding a custom T-wrench. It has a small ghost stamped on the handle. Silence. It was not a normal pause. It was a vacuum. A sudden, complete cessation of all sound, as if the air had been sucked out of the room on the other end of the line. Martinez could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. When the aide's voice returned, it was completely transformed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a tone of sheer, unadulterated panic. Chief, repeat that name. Silas Miller, sir. Oh my God, the aide whispered. Then, his voice became a steel whip. Chief Martinez, listen to me very carefully. You will not, under any circumstances, allow that lieutenant to touch Mr. Miller. You will not allow Mr. Miller to leave that deck. Protect him. The Admiral is on his way. I repeat, the Admiral is en route. We are wheels up in 5 minutes. The line went dead. Martinez stared at his phone, a cold dread mixing with a strange sense of awe. Who in the hell was Silas Miller? Back at the Catapult, Vance had reached his limit. That's it. I'm placing you under restraint. He grabbed the old man's shoulder. It was like grabbing a granite statue. The old man didn't move, but his calm blue eyes met Vance's with a look of profound disappointment. Son, Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. You are making a terrible mistake. Before Vance could reply, a sound sliced through the air that made every sailor on the flight deck freeze. It was the high-pitched squeal of tires. On the pier, a convoy of 3 black SUVs, their government plates and small flags denoting extreme authority, had screeched to a halt at the foot of the carrier's brow. Doors flew open. Men in sharp uniforms and dark suits emerged, moving with a speed and purpose that radiated importance. From the lead vehicle stepped a man who needed no introduction. Admiral Thorne, commander of the entire Atlantic Fleet's air arm, a 4-star Titan whose mere presence on a ship was an event of seismic importance. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at the ship's captain, who was rushing down the brow to greet him. He didn't look at the executive officer. He didn't look at the assembled, gawking crew. His eyes, like guided missiles, locked onto the small drama unfolding at Catapult 2. He strode up the brow, his entourage struggling to keep pace. His steps were thunderous. He moved with a terrifying, focused purpose, a human torpedo aimed at one specific point on his ship. Vance saw him coming. His blood ran cold. He dropped his hand from the old man's shoulder as if it were on fire. He snapped to attention, his mind racing. What had he done? Why was the Admiral here? Thorne didn't stop until he was 1 foot away from the old man in the faded work shirt. The entire, sprawling flight deck had fallen into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the wind whipping across the deck and the distant cry of a gull. Admiral Thorne, a man who commanded fleets and held the careers of thousands in his hand, stood before the stooped, frail civilian. He took a deep breath. Then he executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his 40-year career. His back was ramrod straight. His hand was a perfect, rigid line to his brow. His eyes were locked on the old man's. His voice, when it came, was a booming sound that rolled across the silent deck, filled with a raw, unvarnished emotion that stunned everyone who heard it. Mr. Miller, the Admiral roared. It is an honor, sir. Silas Miller slowly, almost tiredly, raised a hand and gave a small, informal wave, a gesture of a man brushing off an unearned compliment. Hello, James, he said quietly. It's been a while. She's chattering. Admiral Thorne dropped his salute but remained at a rigid position of attention. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the bewildered faces of the flight crew, the engineers, and finally, settling with the force of a physical blow upon Lieutenant J.G. Caden Vance. You see this man? Thorne's voice was lower now, but it had lost none of its power. It was a quiet, lethal register. Do you have any idea who you are standing in the presence of? Vance could only shake his head, mute with shock and a dawning, horrifying sense of dread. This man, the Admiral continued, his voice rising again, a lecture delivered to the entire command, is Silas Miller. When the Navy first bolted steam catapults to a flight deck, they barely worked. They were dangerous, unpredictable beasts. Men died. Planes were lost. The program was on the verge of being scrapped. He pointed a rigid finger at Silas. This man, then a 20-year-old engineering prodigy who refused a commission because he preferred to work with his hands, fixed them. He didn't use schematics. He wrote them. He invented half the tools your technicians still use today. He designed safety protocols that are still in your manuals, though his name is nowhere to be found because he refused the credit. The Admiral took a step closer to his audience, his eyes burning. During Vietnam, on the USS Independence, a catastrophic failure in Catapult 1 threatened to set off a chain reaction of explosions on a fully armed flight deck. While officers were screaming to abandon ship, Silas Miller walked into a cloud of superheated steam with a wrench and a theory. He came out 30 minutes later, burned and deafened, and the catapult worked. He saved $1 billion ship and over 5,000 souls that day. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We didn't call him Silas. We called him the Ghost, because he would appear when things were at their worst, fix the impossible, and then vanish back into the engine rooms without a word. He refused every medal. He turned down every promotion. He asked for only one thing, that we let him keep listening to the machines. Thorne finally turned his full, undivided, and utterly glacial fury upon Vance. "And you, Lieutenant," he whispered, the sound more terrifying than any shout. "You, in your crisp uniform, with your manuals and your regulations. You mistook a Titan for a tourist. You questioned his presence. You mocked the very tool that saved the ship your own grandfather probably served on." Vance's face had gone completely white. He looked as if he might be sick. "You did not see a living legend," Thorne continued, his voice precise and cutting. "You saw an old man. You have disgraced your uniform not through an act of cowardice or malice, but through a profound and unforgivable act of ignorance. You have forgotten that you stand on the shoulders of giants." The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken by the quiet, raspy voice of Silas Miller. He placed a gentle, gnarled hand on the Admiral's stiff arm. "James, that's enough." The Admiral looked at him, the fury in his eyes softening instantly to deep, reverent respect. "He's young," Silas said, looking at the pale, trembling lieutenant. "They teach them to follow the book now. It's a good book. It's just missing a few chapters, the ones you can't write down." He then looked directly at Vance, his blue eyes holding no malice, only a teacher's gentle patience. "Respect isn't in a regulation, son," Silas said softly. "It's in the listening. You have to learn to listen. To the machines. To the men. To the past." He held out the T-handle wrench. "Now, if you'll let me, I'd like to introduce myself to Catapult too. She's been trying to tell you something all morning." Admiral Thorne did not countermand the lesson. He nodded slowly. He then turned to the ship's captain. "Captain," he ordered, his voice once again crisp and authoritative. "Lieutenant Vance and his entire engineering team are to be enrolled in a new, mandatory training course. Effective immediately, they will learn the history of naval engineering, from the first steam engine to the modern reactor. They will learn the names and stories of the men who built this navy with their bare hands and brilliant minds." He glanced back at Silas, who was already kneeling by the catapult track, his ear pressed against the cold steel. "We will call it," the Admiral declared, "the Miller Protocol, so that no officer in my command ever makes this mistake again." 6 months later, Caden Vance sat in a small, greasy spoon diner just outside the naval base. He was no longer a lieutenant junior grade. He was just Caden. He had been reassigned, pending the completion of his remedial training. The Miller Protocol was brutal. It was hours of history, of engineering theory, of reading the faded, handwritten notes of men long dead. It had humbled him. It had broken his arrogance and rebuilt him into something better, something quieter. He was stirring his coffee when the bell over the diner door jingled. Silas Miller walked in. He moved just as slowly, looked just as unassuming. He took a seat at the counter, his back to the room. Caden's heart hammered in his chest. He took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The old man turned on his stool. His pale blue eyes recognized him instantly. He gave a small, gentle smile. "Lieutenant," Silas greeted him. "Sir," Caden said, his voice thick with emotion. I never properly apologized. What I did that day, the way I treated you, it was inexcusable. I was arrogant, and I was ignorant. I am truly, deeply sorry." Silas looked at the young man standing before him. He saw the shame, but he also saw the change. The hard edges of certitude had been worn away, replaced by the softer lines of humility. He patted the empty stool next to him. "Sit down, son," Silas said. "Apology accepted long ago." Caden sat, a wave of relief washing over him. "I learned about the Forrestal," Caden said quietly, "in the protocol, and the Kitty Hawk, and a dozen other things you did that no one ever knew about." Silas just nodded, sipping his water. "The machines needed help. I was there to listen." "You fixed Catapult 2 that day," Caden said. "In 20 minutes. With that wrench. They said you just tapped on a valve housing and it came free." "She wasn't stuck," Silas corrected him gently. She was just scared. You have to know where to tap. You have to know the language. He smiled again, a twinkle in his eye. It's a good lesson. For machines and for people. He turned back to the counter, leaving the young officer to ponder the weight of those simple words, a final chapter in a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life.